Welcome to the Doctor's Corner with Dr. Kline and Janelle Elgaway.
Good evening and welcome to the Doctor's Corner on Call 360 Network. I'm your host, Janelle Elgaway, and we are here with Dr. Kline. Welcome, Dr. Kline. Is Dr. Kline there? Okay. Tonight we are focusing
Oops. on... had the mute button pushed. Oh, dear. The world will come to an end.
Tonight we are focusing on the topic of diabetes. We will also answer a few questions from our mailbag. If you have future mailbag questions, you can send them to my assistant, Jess Stewart. Her email is jstwart@caw360.com. It's CAW360.com. If anyone would like to call in with a question this evening, you can do so at 415-915-2291. There are two ways to listen in to tonight's show: through our website, which is www.cawnation.com, or YouTube channel and search The Doctor's Corner. So, Dr. Kline, is there anything newsworthy that occurred in the last week that you'd like to share with us?
You and I were talking before the show. I was not going to share this because it's a rumor, but you're hearing it as well. So it may turn out to be a rumor, but it looks like the CDC is being pressured into rewriting their guidelines. And they're going to rewrite them without prop members, and that is the group of physicians called the Physicians for Responsible Opioid Prescribing. And basically, they're a group of radical physicians who believe that medicines like this do not work. They cause more problems than not, and they are in favor of limiting their use. I disagree with that, and I have reviewed their manifesto and their references to support their conclusions, as did the FDA. And it's just not stacking up to anything that I can believe as a practicing physician. This group was solely responsible for the writing of the CDC guidelines. Mm-hmm. And I think finally, somewhere in the government, they realized that this is a huge, tragic mistake, because we have 65% of 10 million people who have been cut off their medicines. Some have committed suicide. So if this rumor is true, it's a very good rumor. But on the other hand, CDC has no regulatory standing to be doing this at all. If anybody wants to write guidelines about prescription drugs, it has to be the FDA. Mm-hmm. So that's the news from Woebegone.
Okay. We're going to take a few questions from our mailbag. Someone asked, what steps do you go through, doctors, to get rare surgeries performed?
The most surgeons and most medical centers have networks of people. And if you talk to any surgeon at a medical center or a large hospital, they know each other. And so they know who it is that does these rare surgeries. So the best place to start is with your surgeon. Find a surgeon of a similar ilk. For example, if it's some kind of orthopedic procedure, just call your orthopedic surgeon and say, do you know anybody that does this kind of rare surgery?
Okay. And then another question is, what kind of doctors can patients go to get the diagnosis of autoimmune issues? And they asked if we include like CRPS.
Most all doctors can get started on this, but the profession that's kind of assigned to this is rheumatology. Rheumatology comes from rheumatism, which comes from sore joints. And most all autoimmune diseases have arthritis. So generally, it's a rheumatologist or a specialist in rheumatic diseases.
Okay. Let's see. What should we do if our pain clinic is forcing us to go on buprenorphine?
Say that you need a written statement explaining the rationale, that you would like to share it with other doctors for a second opinion, and you would like to share it with the Board of Registration in Medicine to see what their thoughts are.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to get into tonight's topic, which is on diabetes. And what did you want to exactly go over? Or actually, what are the problems with the way diabetic patients are currently being treated within the United States?
You will only hear this from me. So take that with a grain of salt. But it appears that we've had it wrong about diabetes. And I've been studying this for about 10 years, and I've been studying it pretty intensely until 2 years ago when I set it aside to work on this problem of opiates. But the thing that's always bothered me is this kind of fanatic desire to control blood sugars as if the blood sugar was causing the diabetes. So this would be like in an autoimmune disease, let's say lupus. Lupus, you have a little kidney trouble, you've got some joint troubles, you get skin problems, you've got eye problems. So if you picked one of those, let's say kidney, and you said, well, the kidneys are causing the others complications, and you just went around treating kidney disease and said, look, everything's getting better, then that would be true. And you discover something. But in diabetes, if you treat the blood sugar, in spite of what everybody says, if you really read the research, controlling the blood sugar does not control the outcomes. Now, the outcomes are difficulties with eyes, blood pressure, kidneys, heart attacks. So there's quite a few things. But the question I always tell people to ask their doctors when they say, you know what, this causes blindness. The next question is, how often does it cause the blindness? If you go on the American Diabetic Association website, and they're a very powerful group. They're an independent group. They're affiliated with the Harvard people in Boston. The tight control people, which is the tighter you control the blood sugar, the better you're going to be in the long run. If you believe that the blood sugar is causing all these other problems, then that's correct. But in 1966, 3 pathologists in Boston published a book called The Pathology of Diabetes, what it looks like under the microscope. And what it looks like under the microscope is a lot of damage to small capillaries that cause all of the difficulties. If you injure the capillaries in the kidneys, you have kidney problems. You injure the capillaries in the eye, and you have eye problems. If you injure the arteries feeding your heart, then you're going to have a heart attack. And guess what? If you injure the cells making insulin, they don't make enough. They're injured. So, does the kidney disease cause the blindness? Does the blindness cause the elevated blood sugar? Does the elevated blood sugar cause the kidney disease? What it is these are all organs, the pancreas, the eye, the kidney, and the blood vessels are formed incorrectly in the beginning. It's a genetic disease. And if you look under the microscope, you find what's called basement membrane thickening. Now, basement membrane is kind of like saran wrap. You know, it's the final covering over your dinner. Now, if you made your saran wrap, let's say you could smell through the saran wrap, you could still smell the odors of the food through the saran wrap. So now if you make the saran wrap real thick, you're going to kind of start choking off the fumes coming off your dinner. So the exchange of oxygen and food and medicines occurs in the capillary, the tiniest blood vessel. Maybe you've seen them on YouTube where you can see the single cells rolling through. This is the place where the stuff actually gets into your body, your oxygen, blood sugars, and hormones, everything. So if you have a thickened basement membrane that covers all these cells, things going in and out of the cells are going to go more slowly. So insulin is excreted more slowly because it has to cross this basement membrane. So if you look under the microscope, you can see these thickened basement membranes. And in 1970, a physician, an MD, PhD in California and Texas, published this work after the scientist in 1965 started it off. This guy looked through an electron microscope and really blew up these pictures huge, and you could see this thickened basement membrane. So diabetes has a pathology that you can see under the microscope. And it affects things equally. So the disease is affecting your pancreas that makes insulin, your heart, your everything equally. So the blood sugar is just an equal component of the disease.
How many people actually have diabetes 1 and 2 in the United States?
Well, according to the American Diabetic Association, 1 in 3. And that's pretty absurd. You really think 1 in 3 people have a disease in this country? What they're doing, and if you go to the American Diabetic Association, the ADA website, the first thing you see is donate. This is a large charitable organization that has a very poor charity rating because they spend too much money on the administration. They do give out money for research. That's fine. But their budget is helped by very large grants from companies that make insulin and companies that make oral agents for diabetes. So these people are the ones in the driver's seat making policy, and it's just like, you know, payola anywhere.
Right. How can patients deal with the high prices of insulin? A Yale study said that 1 in 4 patients admitted to cutting back on insulin use because of the cost.
Yeah, this is a big problem. This is healthcare profiteering, much the same as there was profiteering in World War II. There are people taking advantage. Doctors are saying you need to control the blood sugar, more medicine. So the industry goes, well, thank you. We'll do that. And my goodness, there are so many people needing insulin, we're just going to raise the price. So somebody needs to study the price of insulin, and there are studies that show that they've just kind of gone up in price every year, which is not the manufacturing model. What happens generally in manufacturing when you start making more items, more units? Price goes down.
Correct. So
the more insulin you make, the price should go down. But this is raw healthcare profiteering, period. Eli Lilly, and this is when drug companies can be really wonderful. In 1925, when the 2 Canadians discovered that extracts from a dog's pancreas could reverse diabetes in children, I mean, these kids would just waste away to nothing and die within a year. It was horrible. And the first couple of patients they treated, they just turned around. They started to thrive. But they only had a tiny bit. So Eli Lilly comes in and says, we'll split the dough and we'll give some to the university here in Canada, and then we'll manufacture this stuff. So they geared up, and within 5 or 6 months, they had tons of this stuff. And it was wonderful because they were saving kids' lives. So Eli Lilly, went on. We used to call them ethical drug houses when I was in medical school because we thought they were ethical. And so Eli Lilly decided that the insulin they were using, which was pork insulin from hogs, they extracted it from their livers, and they made insulin, and it worked fine. Occasionally, people would get a reaction to it, but not very often. It worked good. It was called porcine insulin, cheap, $20 a month, $30 a month. So then Eli Lilly gets a bunch of bacteria together and they manufacture insulin exactly like human insulin. It's exactly the same thing made by bacteria. So they had to charge a little more. And actually, as time went on, they charged a lot more. And then they stopped making the porcine insulin. So you had no choice. You didn't have a choice of the $20 insulin. You had to go with the $50 insulin. Then they started fiddling with it. And they called it insulin analogs. It didn't change anything. But they were able to get a new patent on it because they fiddled around with a couple of the amino acids. So now we have insulin that's, again, a little different. And then the price now went up to $100. It's basically healthcare profiteering. The studies show that these new insulins are no better than the old ones and not much better than the old hog insulin. But they're making so much money that they're building a $1 billion plant in North Carolina to make even more insulin. Now, why more insulin? Only 5% of the population has type 1 diabetes, where they absolutely need insulin to stay alive. So 95% of the insulin is being used for type 2 diabetes, which is adult onset. And what is diabetes? According to the ADA and according to everything that you read, your blood sugar. But wait a minute. We just said there's pathology to show that your elevated blood sugar is actually just another component, not a causal thing. Now, the people that are making billions and billions and billions of dollars every year developing new drugs to lower your blood sugar, there's now 10 different categories of drugs to lower your blood sugar. They're all published in the New England Journal with assistance of the drug company, of course, which used to be unethical. You publish a study in famous journals like the New England Journal, you would never allow a study paid for by a drug company. And it takes a while to read these because they're very clever. The internal parts of the study are always fine. They're starting to use some flimsy statistics called hazard ratios, and they're using them inappropriately. But they always conclude that these new drugs have less heart disease, heart attacks, and none of this is true because they haven't done it long term. As a matter of fact, there were huge studies done back in the 1980s and 1990s with 4,000 and 5,000 people in them, where they gave half the group strict insulin controls and diets, and they gave the other half, well, you just do whatever you want. No difference. There is no proof anywhere that lowering the blood sugar changes the degree of blindness and amputations and dialysis. Now, those things are used to frighten people into thinking that if they just control their blood sugars, they'll prevent these. And that's not true. What's actually happening with this tight control is people are suffering more low blood sugar. Now, low blood sugar and low oxygen are the two death knells for all cells. So if you put your cell under hypoxic stress, which means you can't breathe enough oxygen, you're not going to last long. And if you put your cells under stress of not getting enough blood sugar because you're running around taking too much insulin, you're really injuring your body, your basic metabolism, your basic cells, a lot more so than if your blood sugar was high. But the fanaticism, and words in this article here, epidemic of diabetes. Have we heard that before? Mm-hmm. Epidemic of diabetes. Using the same phony statistics, it is estimated that more than 20 million people in the United States has diabetes. Now, what's the definition of diabetes? Elevated blood sugar. My experience has been, and my current hypothesis is, if you cannot find evidence of the pathology of diabetes anywhere in your body, you don't have it. Pathology is the basis of disease. If you have cancer, you make a slide, you see it under the microscope. If you make a slide and you don't see anything under the microscope, you cannot make the diagnosis of cancer. So what can we can't go in and do biopsies of our pancreas or kidneys, but there's a place where you can actually visualize your capillaries. It's in the back of your eye. Your eye is a window to the inside of your body. You can see the little blood vessels. And what happens with diabetes, because of this weakness of the capillaries, you get changes in the back of your eye that any eye doctor, any optometrist or ophthalmologist can see. It just shows up. So my current thinking is, if you don't have evidence of kidney damage with special kidney tests, and especially you don't have evidence of damage in the back of your eye, you do not have the pathological disease of diabetes. You may have an elevated blood sugar. So the blood sugars are set by these panels. They had one at the United Nations, and they met in this back room, and it was all the tight control zealots. Let's get the blood sugar down, get the blood sugar down, because that'll save your life. American Diabetic Association, send us money, get the blood sugar down. And they use terms like getting in on the fight against diabetes. And how can you help the fight against diabetes? Send money. We need a cure for diabetes. Well, if you look under the microscope, you're never going to get a cure. It's a genetic disease. And even Jocelyn, the great Boston diabetologist who had 40,000 patients, said in his book, diabetes is inherited, period. And he was right. It's definitely an inherited disease. It's an inherited defect in these little tiny capillaries. So you're not going to ever cure it. You can send money to these people, but you're not going to cure it. Someone was just talking about they went in and checked their A1C. Now, A1C is a clever little blood test that shows you your average blood sugars. But you remember, we're still focusing on blood sugars now. The A1C is an average blood sugar. So here's a chart. Maybe we can. Okay, and this was published by David Nathan, who published the one study that showed there might be improvements out of 10 studies that didn't show improvements. He wrote this article about A1C and the average blood sugar. So what is the average blood sugar if your A1C is 8? Well, 183 is the average, but the range for an A1C of 8 is 150 to 220. Then if you look at 9, the range is 170 to 250, which means it contains the 220. A1C of 10, 190 to 280, contains 220. 11 starts off with 220. That means if you have an average blood sugar of 220, you can have an A1C of 8, 9, 10, or 11. The A1C is a test that probably shouldn't be used because it's unstable. I mean, if you get on a scale in the morning and it says you're 150 pounds, the next morning you get on there and it's 170, next morning it's 130, you got a bad scale. Well, A1C is a bad number. Not only that, but I actually spoke with the person that invented this test at Harvard. And this test depends on other factors, like how long your red cells survive, which is sort of a funny thing. But point is, in different people, you're going to get a different value. So if Janelle has an average blood sugar of 150 and I have an average blood sugar of 150, we're likely to have different A1Cs. And people are just glommed onto this. They're doing things like, oh, your A1C is 8.1. That's higher than last time when it was 8. We need to give you more drugs and insulin to lower your blood sugar. So it becomes a bad trap. Healthcare profiteers make a fortune off faulty logic.
How many people are having issues with death from low blood sugar because of this?
I've got some data on that, and it's kind of alarming. I can bring it up next week and have better numbers, but the number of hospitalizations and deaths from hypoglycemia is definitely concerning. And it's definitely higher than before they started using insulin. Insulin's got a lot of bad properties too. A lot of people don't know this, but if you have the severest form of diabetic eye disease called proliferative eye disease, insulin can make it worse. Worse. These are inconvenient facts that people ignore, but it's there. It's there in the literature. There's nothing in it for me to make this up. I mean, why would I make this up? I don't have any investment in anything. I don't belong to an organization. I'm not a drum beater. It's just me as a practicing physician watching people's lives turn into hunched over their glucometers, checking their blood sugar 7 and 8 times a day. And then here's another thing from the American Diabetic Association. Meal plans to control your blood sugar. So people's lives become completely centered around this disease. No wonder they have to fight the disease, because the treatment is much worse than the disease. Basically, people with type 2 diabetes can relax. They don't need insulin. And there's some circumstances in which people do need insulin, and it has to do with ketones in your blood. In other words, there's actually a marker in your blood that lets you know you're at a critical level and you're going to need insulin. I would say out of 1,000 diabetics, that maybe type 2 diabetics, maybe 2 or 3 need insulin. Do you know how many are on now? Almost 50%. That's healthcare profiteering.
We have a few calls. A caller from area code 502. What is your name and what's your question?
Steve.
Hi, Steve.
This is Steve.
Hi, Steve.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
But the thing that Dr. Kline in the pricing issues that we have with insulin and medicines in the whole, insulin in particular, you need to put into the equation 2 things that happened since about 1970. One is most all of our insurance companies went from being mutual companies, which meant that they were not for profit, and went demutualized in the 90s. They became for profit and publicly held companies. And insulin was an over-the-counter item. Back in the late 60s, we didn't have 100-unit insulin. We had 40 and 80, and the whopping price was normally about 99 cents or $1.98 for the 2 strengths. So when the prescription benefit managers came into play and insulin became a prescription item, all hell started breaking loose with prescription prices, because the PBMs were telling the drug manufacturers, if you want your drug in this category on our formulary, you will pay us X percent, X dollars per unit or what have you. Back in the late 60s, when everything was brand name and everything was cash, the average prescription price was about $4 or $5. Today, and today when we're using 80-85% generics, and the PBMs are controlling the price of a similar percentage of all the prescriptions, the average price is pushing for $60. If you applied the consumer price index or the cost of living adjustment index to that.
Well, isn't this exactly what we were saying with the healthcare profiteering? These people are profiteering, correct?
Well, yeah, but we have, and I think you're old enough to be in my vintage, is that we have too many middlemen in our system.
Yeah, even the president
with the promise.
Well, yeah, even the president said, we got to get rid of these prescription drug managers, these middlemen,
PBMs,
who are PBMs, yeah, who are just cleaning up because they were supposed to pass the savings on to the government. They were supposedly like government contractors to get lower prices, and they haven't. They figured out a way to keep the money. But what is your question about this?
Well, my it was more a statement than a question. Is that these middlemen that have come into the system since you and I started practicing in the healthcare field with the illusion of saving the system and everybody money have imposed costs and overhead and the desire of profits. And
well, do you think that we should be? Do you think we should become activists and support President Trump about getting rid of these people?
I think we should. Well, they were created. I don't want to sound anti-union, but they started with a contract with UAW, Ford, Harvester, GM, John Deere, and Chrysler back in the fall of '69.
But do you think we should get rid of them? Do you think we should campaign to have congressional investigation, look into the matter? I think one of the things that I admire most about our democracy is the Senate and House hearings. They can get at the truth. It's just an amazing process. And so maybe it's time we have the Oversight Committee, look into the prescription drug benefit managers, PBMs, because they're not only harming the government by keeping the money, they certainly are harming patients by jacking up their prices. But your points are well taken. Thank you.
One small fact a lot of people don't know about is that the insurance industry as a whole, almost all prescription benefit managers are licensed insurance companies. Back, I think, in 1938, they were exempted from Sherman antitrust with a little law called McCarran-Ferguson Act. Now, it was passed for a good reason to allow the insurance companies to share data to get better actuarial data to determine premium prices. But today, that's no longer needed, but they have expanded their scope of utilizing that exemption to where they can extort money from drug manufacturers and others without.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for this, but we need to move on and hear from some other callers if you don't mind.
I'm
thank you.
Sorry.
That's
Not
all right.
a problem. Bye.
Thanks, Steve. Caller from area code 541. What is your name and what's your question?
Is it me, Janelle?
Yes, it's you.
Can you hear me?
I could hear you.
Hi, my name is Steve Hicks. I'm an Oregon resident, and I got to thank both of you. You've turned me from a victim to a survivor. Thank you very much.
Good for you.
Do you have a couple things I'd like to ask you about? I've been researching the diabetic issue because my uncle goes through dialysis 3 or 4 times a day. And I really dug into it, and I found that there are certain areas in India that have never even heard of diabetes, that there's no such thing. And that it has something to do with turmeric in their diet. I wonder if you could maybe help us out with that. And also, something that goes back even further than the 70s, which was that last man which was talking about, which is, if I'm pretty sure I've researched this thoroughly, and to my understanding, I think that it was under the Eisenhower administration, there was a big scare about diabetes, and there were several people that managed to get these huge contracts that basically said that anybody who needs dialysis can get it, and the government will not deny them. And from what I understand, those people still hold those same contracts. And to your very point of absolute profiteering off of the insurance company, God, I'm getting taken from every side, every month.
Well,
if that's true, or if maybe you can enlighten me some.
No, you are correct. The dialysis industry is something else that needs to be investigated because the government has said you get dialysis if your creatinine is 5.0. But I have a lot of patients whose creatinines were 5.0 and did fine for years. So yes, that's another healthcare profiteering system needs to be looked into. In the 1950s, that's when dialysis started. So yeah, I would agree Eisenhower was probably involved. In terms of turmeric causing diabetes, you see, if you believe that the blood sugar causes the disease, then anything that increases the blood sugar is going to cause the disease. When I was in medical school, I remember endocrinology professor said, you know what? Blood sugar is one of the few things in your body that's influenced by everything else in your body. All your hormones, all your whatevers. And I'll give you an example of bad thinking. After you eat, your blood sugar goes up, right? Makes sense. And it can go up to 200. So 200 is a survivable number, right? If the normal person can go up to 200 after their meals, 200 is normal. So how come we don't tell diabetics, keep your blood sugar under 200? But we don't. We tell them to keep it under 125, 140. Keep driving it down. Get it lower and lower, because the lower it is, the less likelihood you're going to have one of these god-awful blindness and lose your legs and go on dialysis. What could be more horrible? But nobody ever asks the ADA, oh, how often is this? Less than 1% of diabetics will lose their vision. And even if they do lose it, it's not as bad as you think. It's not dark blindness. That is very rare. But if you read the American Diabetic Association, blindness from diabetes is the commonest cause of blindness in the country. Well, that's because there's a lot of diabetics. And the other diseases are rare. That is another statement to frighten people into donating, checking their blood sugars 20 times a day. Jocelyn used
Fear
to check.
tactic.
Yes, scare tactics in order to sell more products. In other words, there's a lot of people making money on these glucose strips because people are checking them all day long, changing the way they eat. You don't have to do that. That is an example of the treatment being far worse than the disease. Kid goes to even in type 1 diabetes, kid goes to a party. Little Freddie here can't have any cake and ice cream. But why? Because they're afraid of the blood sugar. Oh my God, if his blood sugar goes up, the poor kid's going to end up on dialysis and his legs are going to be amputated. Number of amputations is also less than 1%. Number of people on dialysis, less than 1%. That means you got a 99% chance you're going to be fine. Fine.
So could you correlate it to the pretend fabricated opioid crisis?
Yeah, there are little similarities, but I didn't want to get into that.
Well, I know you didn't, but it's that
running
correlation.
Fear. Fear. It's really a hyperglycemic phobia.
It's a winning proposition during election time for whatever reason.
Well, yeah, and it's a winning proposition when people like the ADA need more money. There
you have it. Dr. Kline and Jonelle, your true blessings in my life. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for calling in.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Jonelle. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So, what is the most expensive thing that a diabetic has to use? I mean, I know they have insulin. They have the strips.
A lot of remember, there's 10 groups now of pills that lower your blood sugar. And of course, they're finding all kinds of problems with them. It seems that if you give a pill to lower your blood sugar, you're doing something unnatural. Your body doesn't like to have its blood sugar lowered. And since, your blood sugar is 250 or 300, so what? If you tell a doctor that somebody's blood sugar is 300, they'll fall over in a sweat because they bought into lower the blood sugar or else you're going to die. You're going to have all these problems. the researchers actually are kind of at the point with diabetes is, yeah, there's a little higher incidence of heart disease, but some other families have higher incidence too, and they don't have diabetes. It seems to be linked genetically, so you got to take care of yourself and do all the things that you would normally do that people who have a high risk for heart disease and stroke do. You take aspirin and you use statins, and if you want to exercise and you want to have a healthy diet and all those kinds of things, go for it. But the diabetic diets of meals, they have meal plans. You can get on the ADA website, meal plans. Imagine, and they talk about diabetic control. This is diabetic control with a capital C. They're attempting to control every aspect of your life.
How much does the middleman in all this play a part with the medications and all the different things that are needed? Well,
you can't just have diabetes and check your blood sugar every once in a while. You have to have a team. You got a dietitian, you got a physical therapist. Anybody that can get in on it, right, is going to make money. So there's a lot of people, healthcare profiteering, the kind of middlemen. Of course, the big middlemen are what we just talked about, the prescription or the pharmacy benefit managers. There's only 3 of them. These are Express Scripts at CVS and Silver Scripts. There's 3 gigantic benefit managers, and these are just basically wholesalers that have no controls put on them. Wholesaling is fine in all of business, and it works very well. But wholesaling is a competitive business. There's lots of wholesalers. There's wholesalers that wholesale car parts and things like that. And car parts are actually inexpensive. It's surprising. That's because there's competition. There's no competition amongst the 3 benefit managers. My guess is that the prices seem to be kind of similar, and I'll just leave the conclusions to you before they come at me with their lawyers. But anytime you don't have enough people, you're going to get less competition. The reason the ACA was passed, the Obamacare, was to try to reintroduce competition amongst healthcare insurers, because like in North Carolina, Blue Cross is the only one. And lo and behold, some little company managed to wheedle its way into North Carolina. And I read in the paper, oh, North Carolina lowering premiums. It works. Competition works. So yeah, the middlemen are a problem.
Somebody wrote in and they asked, how can we advocate to impact the lowering of insulin prices?
Well, actually, the American Diabetic Association is trying to do something to lower prices. I don't know. The way to lower prices is have competition. Mm. And you're not going to have competition with the way drugs are licensed in the U.S. There needs to be more foreign manufacturers go through the FDA. Our FDA is very important. We do manage to screen things, and they'd always try to speed it up, right? What happens when you speed it up? Yep, it gets sloppy. We need to have more foreign manufacturers come into the United States through the FDA after FDA approval. And there are some, but there is a fixed pricing scheme that's been in place ever since Congress passed a law said you cannot, Medicare cannot competitively bid. In Canada, the same drug that we pay $10 for, same drug in Canada, $5. Healthcare profiteering.
Is there a safe and more effective, cost-effective to order online insulin from other countries?
That I can't answer. I think it's got to be FDA approved. I mean, if you're just buying stuff from another country, they don't have an FDA. Who knows, what the purity is and stuff. So I think I'd be a little wary about that, especially with insulin and some of the newer drugs that are real expensive. You see, when things are too expensive, people go elsewhere. I think it's illegal to get prescriptions in Canada, but a lot of people do it. And if you're getting, and you've got a trustworthy pharmacy and there are some in Canada. That might be something to look into. Again, I don't know what the legality is, but I know a lot of people do it.
Someone asked, what do you think is the best kind of meter to check the BS?
The best kind of meter is one that also does ketones. And right now that's Abbott's Precision meter that will do both. And there's another one called Nova that will do both. Ketones are actually the most important part of regulating diabetes. Serum ketones are very, very accurate and indicative always of a problem. If you've got elevated ketones, you're either starving yourself on a funny diet, or if you have diabetes, you either have too low blood sugar or dangerously high blood sugar. Now, people go into what's called ketoacidosis. That's diabetic. It's called diabetic coma, but diabetic coma can be either way. This is the kind when your blood sugar is super high and you're out of it, and you go into the hospital and they have to treat you with intravenous insulin. The pediatricians don't use blood sugars to monitor people in the ICU. They use finger stick ketones, because the ketones are the emergency response when you don't have enough insulin. So it's very accurate. And if in my practice, we used to check people's ketones, and I found out they do this in Boston at the Joslin Clinic for Children. If you monitor your ketones, and they're fine, then you can forget about the blood sugar. Now, people say, oh, high blood sugars, you'll get diabetic coma. No, not without the elevated ketones. See the backward thinking? People in the hospital with ketoacidosis or diabetic coma have very high blood sugars. And so the blood sugar must have caused this. No, not true. There are people running around with blood sugars of 400. I had a lady who had a blood sugar of 700. I couldn't believe it. So we did different tests. We made sure it was really the blood sugar, and it was, and she was fine. But we couldn't stand it. So we started giving her insulin, and sure enough, her blood sugar collapsed. We should have left her alone. I mean, she did okay. We bailed her out. But you see, this neurosis, even that I had, I'll get the blood sugar down. My God. She was fine. So the serum ketones in those 2 meters are good. The strips are expensive. They're $5 a piece. But you don't have to do them that often. You can manage your diabetes by checking an occasional blood sugar, like once a week or something, or you can do a urine test. And if you really don't feel right and you think something's wrong, you do a finger stick ketone, which is hydroxybutyrate. 2 kinds of ketones in urines, but the blood sugar is only one kind. So if you buy one of those 2 meters and you buy yourself a few strips and save them up, and you're worried, just prick your finger, and if your ketones are okay, you are okay. And that's based on the pathophysiology, based on the biochemistry of diabetes.
We have another caller, caller from area code 980. What is your name and what's your question for Dr. Kline?
Hey, this is Jessica Stewart, and I have a question. What happens when your ketones are consistently too high?
Something's wrong.
What do you do?
Something's wrong. Now, there aren't very many false positives. The finger stick, when they correlated it with hospital-drawn ketone levels, blood ketone levels, very, very accurate. It depends on how high it is. If it's just a little over normal, it may be because you're not eating. But anybody that's got an elevated serum ketone needs to have it tracked down, figure out what's going on.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's just, I know personally, my primary doctor, he just kept telling me nothing's wrong. No, it's just an infection or whatnot. But I know that I tracked it myself. I always go online and look at my reports and my labs consistently, and it was consistent for like 4 or 5 months, and they wouldn't look into it. So I guess at that point, what would you do? Just get a second opinion?
Well, it depends on how high it is, and it depends on what test they did. Some hospitals are just doing a drop on a little tablet that has to be a serum hydroxybutyrate level. You have to be sure you got the right test, because some of those other tests, dropping a little serum on a tablet is not very accurate. Hydroxybutyrate level.
Thank you for calling in, Jess. Why isn't there generic forms of insulin?
I don't know. What happens is they keep manufacturing new. Remember, I said the analogs. Well, the analogs are just really, kind of putting rouge on a pig. It's still a pig, and they're just healthcare profiteering. They're getting away with murder, and so what they do is they get a new license. If they put it in a pen, these pens are horrible. I mean, they're real convenient, but they're terribly expensive. So each time they do that, they get a patent, and the patent's good for 7 years. So you can't make it generic. I think maybe the American Diabetic Association, who's looking into this, might come up with some solutions to finding less expensive insulin. I think the way to start is to get yourself a meter, buy some strips for the ketones, and start slowly lowering your insulin. My experience has been when I had older type 2 diabetics that are on insulin all the time, when you slowly taper it off, their blood sugars drop because they are doing what's called a Somogyi effect. Somogyi effect is your blood sugar looks high, but it actually is in response to a lower blood sugar previously. So if I gave Janelle an injection of insulin and forced her blood sugar down, within a few minutes, her body would try to save her, and it jacks the blood sugar up. So all of a sudden, your blood sugar is real high, but it's a result of a low blood sugar. Tricky, the Somogyi effect. Somogyi was the first biochemist at the great St. Louis, Washington University in St. Louis.
Interesting. Someone asked, how much is insulin without insurance? Do you know?
No, you don't. And, nowadays, when you want to find out the price of stuff, you have no idea, because the pharmacy benefit managers are fiddling with the prices all the time, cutting deals with pharmacists. And by the way, the deals they cut with a pharmacist until now, they were forced into secrecy. So you go to a pharmacy and you cut a deal, but you can't tell your other pharmacy friends.
Right.
Well, they just got rid of that, so that's nice. No, you don't know. The thing to do is go online to these comparison shopping things. They're pretty good, and they will look around your area at different pharmacies for different prices. And so you just plug in. Let's see what I do the other day. Comparison drug prices. Raleigh, and I got all these comparison drug prices, and hey, there were huge differences. I was actually looking up dope. I was looking up opiates, and for oxycodone, which is a pretty cheap, there was a difference between pharmacies of like 50%. So try that, and talk to your pharmacist. They really are your friends, and say, look, what can I do to lower my insulin prices, aside from taking less insulin, and they can be very helpful. So,
how do patients with diabetes afford to live and take care of families? How are they doing this?
Well, they're the milk cows for the drug companies, and so who cares? As long as they're running down there paying $500 a month for their pills, do we care? Well, it's pretty awful, really. But a conservative approach can save a lot of money. Metformin, which is the old-fashioned and least expensive oral agent for type 2 diabetes, works in most cases to lower your blood sugar if you want to lower your blood sugar. Now, guess what? They did a study on metformin, old-fashioned metformin, or glucophage, it used to be called, which effectively lowers your blood sugar. And they looked at the outcomes several years later. Guess what? No difference. So our old friend metformin, which if you want to lower your blood sugar, I would suggest you talk to your doctor about. All the other 8 categories of blood sugar lowering, I personally feel as a doctor are unnecessary in 99% of cases. I think it's one of the worst mistakes made in modern medicine because these things have side effects, they're horribly expensive, and it's based on lowering the blood sugar, right?
Right.
So, if we have evidence that lowering the blood sugar helps you, that's fine, but it has not yet appeared.
So we have an issue with the healthcare system, it seems like. There's this opioid crisis. Now there's this crisis where people are dying because they feel like they have to, if they can't pay for their insulin, they're extending it out and dying because of that, possibly. I know there's been a few people that have gotten coverage in the news lately. What do we have to do about all this? I mean, why are all these issues coming up if the United States healthcare is supposed to be number 1 in the world and we have all this money? What's going on?
We have a democracy, and I just heard by way of the grapevine that the governor in Oregon, Kate Brown, who's kind of going along with these fanatics, they want to cut all the Medicaid patients off opiates. She didn't know that people were being tapered.
Really?
In other words, if you don't inform the politicians, they have no way of knowing. So, back to the politicians and going in and talking to them and say, did you know that I'm paying $600 a month for my diabetic supplies? And I'm kind of wondering if I even need to do this. Do I need to prick my finger all the time? And maybe we should look into this price fixing of the benefit managers. Why are the prices so high? There is kind of a general knowledge, but really, politicians need to hear it from their constituents. Need to hear a story. Very important to go in there and meet them face to face. And they actually like that. They feel their job is to help out the public. And we don't use them enough. You just call up the office and say, I want 15 minutes with the representative or the senator to talk about what's going on with my diabetes medicines. They'll listen. They might assign you to an aide, but that's okay. The aides just run right in and talk to the representative or the senators. So that's okay as long as you're there face to face giving your story.
We're going to wrap up here, but is there anything else that you'd like to talk about before we get going?
The problem with diabetes over-treatment is something you're going to have a hard time proving because there are very few doctors that believe this way. But if you do careful Google searches, for example, does metformin change the complications, or outcomes is the word you use when you're looking outcomes. They call these outcomes of diabetes. They're not really outcomes. They're really part of the diabetes. But when you're searching, you're looking for diabetic complications, diabetic outcomes, and see if you can find some of these papers. I've got 3,000 of them here in my office, but I put them in a closet because I'm working on this opioid thing. Someday I'll come out of the closet.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kline, for joining us this evening. Tomorrow night at 8/7 Central, guest Dr. Moshe Diekel, a holistic doctor, will join us at Conspiracies Against Wellness. And I want to say a big thank you to our audience for joining us and taking some time out of your evening. I'm Janelle Elgoway with Dr. Kline, signing off until next Tuesday. Have a good night.
Good evening.
This has been The Doctor's Corner with Dr. Kline and Janelle Elgaway. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved.